Gunfire echoed through the Tanzanian hills, but the Germans couldn't see who was shooting. Their column, once proud and gleaming, was now choking in dust and confusion. They had marched straight into an ambush laid by Chief Mkwawa, the man who would make Berlin tremble. It was August 17, 1891. The morning sun beat down on the valley of Lugalo, near present-day Iringa in southern Tanzania. The German Schutztruppe had never known defeat in Africa. They were armed with modern Mauser rifles, machine guns, and carried the arrogance of the empire with every step. To them, African resistance was only a temporary nuisance, something to be crushed quickly with superior firepower. Yet, on that morning, they were about to discover the limits of their own certainty. One African chief was about to change everything. His name was Mkwawa, Chief Mkwawa, a name that meant conqueror of many lands. He was the ruler of the Hehe, a disciplined and militarily organized kingdom that dominated the southern highlands. In an era when European powers carved up Africa like a feast, Mkwawa was building something few outsiders understood: a centralized African state that controlled trade routes, forged alliances, and thrived on a martial culture refined over generations. The Hehe were not a loose confederation of tribes. They were a military society that prized discipline, loyalty, and cunning on the battlefield. To Berlin, this campaign was supposed to be a simple show of strength, a demonstration of German authority over a rebellious chief. Commissioner Emil von Zalewski, who had earlier served in the brutal suppression of the coastal Abushiri revolt, led the expedition. He saw the Hehe not as equals, but as an obstacle to German expansion. His orders were clear: march inland, destroy Mkwawa's power base, and establish German rule once and for all. To him, this was a punitive expedition, swift, decisive, and inevitable. But to Mkwawa, it was something else entirely. This was war, a test not only of weapons, but of intelligence, courage, and strategy. He had studied the Germans carefully. He had watched their methods, measured their arrogance, and learned their weaknesses. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Mkwawa refused to confront the Europeans in open battle, where firepower often decided the outcome. He preferred to control the battlefield, to turn terrain into a weapon and surprise into his greatest ally. The valley at Lugalo was his choice: steep hills on both sides, narrow escape routes, and dense vegetation that concealed his warriors. It was the perfect trap. Before the gunfire at Lugalo, the march, one that began with arrogance and ended in annihilation. Mkwawa was not a warlord. He was the heir of a system, one built by his father Munyigumba, refined into a machine of mobility and silence. The Hehes did not fight battles. They orchestrated them. Regiments drilled by discipline, guided by scouts who could read terrain like scripture. Chiefs and messengers kept the highlands humming with information. Long before the Germans dreamed of conquest, the Hehe had turned their homeland into a living battlefield. By the late 1880s, Mkwawa had already read the future. Every treaty, every German flag raised over a distant hill, carried the same ultimatum: submit or vanish. So he built watchtowers on ridges, fortified key settlements, and placed informants along trade routes. Nothing moved in Hehe country without his knowing. When Zalewski's expedition left the coast in July 1891, columns of soldiers, porters, and carriers trailed into the interior. Mkwawa knew their numbers, their direction, and their overconfidence, but he did not yet strike. He wanted understanding, not destruction. So he sent envoys, unarmed messengers bearing words, not weapons, to speak of peace, of borders, of coexistence. The Germans killed them in response. Those envoys never returned. cut down in cold blood, their bodies left as warnings. That moment changed everything. The silence of diplomacy gave way to the silence of vengeance. Mkwawa gathered his council and spoke one vow. If they refuse to speak as men, they will remember us as warriors. For them, the march to Lugalo was a reckoning. Scouts shadowed the invaders like ghosts, marking every step, every mistake. At night, the Hehe moved barefoot, silent, faces smeared with dust and war paint. Spears in hand, captured rifles slung across shoulders. 3 wings, front to block, flanks to crush, rear to seal. A living circle, tightening by the hour. Zalewski marched blind. He scorned warnings, mocked fear, and punished doubt. Porters whispered of movement in the hills. Askaris heard drums that faded with the wind. But he saw nothing. He believed silence meant safety. He did not know silence was Hehe's war cry. The path narrowed. The air grew heavy. The bush thickened, then fell still. Every step now was a step into the grave Mkwawa had dug. By dawn, August 17, 1891, the land of Lugalo lay ready. The German column that entered Lugalo that morning was large and confident. Zalewski commanded about 320 men, a mix of German officers, European non-commissioned officers, and African askaris, accompanied by porters. They carried modern rifles, ammunition wagons, and field equipment, every sign of imperial might. They expected another routine display of dominance, another quick victory over what they believed was a primitive enemy. What they did not know was that hidden among the ridges and thick bush around them were more than 3,000 Hehe warriors. They had waited silently through the night, positioned precisely where Mkwawa had placed them. These were not undisciplined fighters, but soldiers of a standing army, trained in coordinated tactics. They knew every path, every ridge, every blind corner of the Lugalo Valley. The sun had barely risen when the German column entered the valley. The air was dry, the ground firm, perfect marching weather. Commissioner Emil von Zalewski rode at the head, scanning the ridges as his men pushed forward. To him, it was just another day's march through a hostile country. He saw no enemy, no visible threat. But that was exactly what Chief Mkwawa wanted. For hours, they watched the German lines stretch into the valley. Soldiers, askaris, porters, and ammunition wagons moving in single file, hemmed in by slopes on both sides. Once inside, there would be no room to deploy, no space to form firing lines. They were walking into a killing ground. At the center, Zalewski's officers marched with confidence. Their rifles were slung casually across their shoulders. The Maxim gun crews rolled their heavy weapons at the rear, ready to set up if needed. They believed they commanded the field. What they didn't realize was that they had already surrendered control. The clash began after a German shot shattered a tense moment. Some say accidental, others say it followed the killing of Hehe envoys. The Hehe then attacked with spears and shields from concealed positions, used the valley and close combat to neutralize German rifles, and overwhelmed Zalewski's column. His men couldn't see the enemy. Smoke and dust filled the air. Mkwawa's warriors rose from the grass in waves. The front regiment charged downhill, spears glinting in the morning sun. They moved fast, faster than the Germans expected. Zalewski's men fired blindly into the bush, but the angles were wrong. Their shots hit trees, rocks, and empty air. Before they could reload, the first Hehe spears were already among them. The Maxim gun never fired. Its crew was cut down before they could set it up. Ammunition wagons overturned as panicked men tried to maneuver them in the narrow pass. Horses reared and bolted, trampling soldiers as they fled. Officers barked commands that no one heard. Within minutes, the column had collapsed into chaos. Zalewski tried to rally his men at the center, forming a defensive ring. Rifles cracked, and a few Hehe warriors fell, but more kept coming. They swarmed from all sides, closing the circle, hurling spears, firing captured muskets, shouting war cries that echoed through the valley. Every step the Germans took backwards brought them closer to death. It wasn't a battle anymore, it was annihilation. In 15 minutes, the firing slowed. Most of the German officers were dead. The Askaris had scattered or fallen where they stood. The porters were gone. The valley floor was littered with broken rifles, overturned wagons, and bodies. Zalewski himself was struck down near the center, killed alongside his staff. When the last shots faded, silence returned to Lugalo, the heavy, breathless silence that followed total victory. Over the next few hours, fighting continued as a small group of German survivors, led by Lieutenant von Tettenborn, retreated to a defensive position on a hill. They managed to repel further Hehe attacks and gather other survivors throughout the day before escaping under the cover of darkness. News of Lugalo traveled fast. In Dar es Salaam, German officials refused to believe it at first. An entire column wiped out? Impossible. Yet reports from survivors confirmed the truth. Zalewski's expedition had been destroyed, his men slaughtered to the last officer. The empire that thought itself invincible had just suffered one of its worst defeats in Africa. For him, Lugalo was resistance against the empire and revenge for the envoy killed. The Hehe had not only defended their land, they had rewritten the rules of colonial warfare. In 15 minutes, they turned German arrogance into caution and forced Europe to see them as more than subjects, as soldiers. But victory carried a cost. Mkwawa knew this would not be the end. Germany would come again, in greater numbers, with vengeance in its heart. The question now was not whether they would return, but whether the Hehe could survive the storm they had summoned. Over the next 3 years, German East Africa became a war zone. Reinforcements poured in thousands of new troops, heavy artillery, and fresh commanders determined to erase the memory of Lugalo. Their mission was simple: break the Hehe kingdom, kill Mkwawa, and restore the myth of European invincibility. But Mkwawa was no longer fighting the war he had started. Lugalo had proven his tactics worked. Now he adapted. The chief turned the highlands into a maze of ambushes and strongholds. From his fortress at Kalenga, he directed a campaign of resistance built on speed, deception, and knowledge of the land. The Germans would march in columns, burn villages, seize ground, and find nothing. The Hehe vanished when attacked, reappeared when least expected, and struck where German control was weakest. For 7 years, Mkwawa frustrated every German advance. Convoys vanished, patrols were wiped out, colonial administrators lived under constant fear. "We cannot catch this man," one officer wrote. "He is everywhere and nowhere." In Berlin, frustration turned into obsession. To them, Mkwawa was no longer just a rebel, he was a stain on the empire's pride. The frustration in Berlin was so intense that the German colonial administration placed a reward of 5,000 rupees on Mkwawa's head. By 1894, Germany launched its full-scale retaliation. Under Colonel Freiherr Friedrich von Schele, a massive expedition marched south with artillery and overwhelming firepower. Their target, Kalenga Fortress, the heart of Mkwawa's power. For weeks, the Germans shelled the stronghold, walls crumbled. The Hehe defenders fought back fiercely, but the pressure was too great. On October 30th, 1894, the fortress fell. Yet Mkwawa was nowhere to be found. By 1898, surrounded and isolated, he made his final stand. And in his last act of defiance, Chief Mkwawa took his own life, choosing death over surrender. And the story didn't end there. In a final insult, German officers took his skull back to Europe, proof, they said, of triumph. Yet that very skull would later become a diplomatic question at the Treaty of Versailles, when world powers debated its return to Africa. It took until 1954 for Mkwawa's remains to come home, enshrined at the Mkwawa Memorial Museum in Kalenga, the same fortress where he made his last stand. If you want more untold stories of African victories that shook empires, hit subscribe and keep witnessing the battles they never wanted you to remember.